All right, let's talk about President George W. Bush. He served from 2001 to 2009. Essential question for today is what domestic and foreign challenges did President George W. Bush face during his presidential terms? We'll talk about things he did at home and things that he did abroad. First, little background information. George W. Bush is the son of former President George H.W. Bush. He was the governor of Texas from 1995 to 2000. In November of 2000, Bush became president after winning a majority of the Electoral College in the closest presidential election in U.S. history. All right, the 2000 election. Let's talk a little bit about the candidates. Bush's Democratic opponent was Bill Clinton's Vice President Al Gore. Despite Clinton's successes, the Democrats were weakened by Clinton's impeachment scandal. Gore was also hurt by the emergence of a third-party candidate, author and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, as well as by a downturn in the American economy. Bush was able to gain further popularity when he performed better than expected in the presidential debates. The actual election. On election night, Al Gore won the popular vote by 500,000 votes. In some states, the margin was so narrow that the winner of the Electoral College remained unclear for weeks. Bush appeared to hold a narrow lead in Florida, pending a final count. If either candidate won Florida, where Bush's brother was governor, it would give him enough electoral votes to win the presidency. At first, it appeared that Bush had carried the state, but after a mandatory recount, his lead was fewer than 1,000 votes. Not only was the Florida vote close, there were also questions regarding its accuracy. Pardon me. Thousands of voters had not fully punched in the holes in their paper ballots to indicate the candidate they were voting for. During the count, vote counting machines had ignored these ballots. Gore demanded a recount by hand in 4 Florida counties. State officials refused to extend the deadline for this recount and were supported by a lower state court. State officials certified Bush as the winner of Florida's electoral votes. Gore appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, which demanded a statewide recount. Bush then appealed that decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled by a narrow 5-4 vote in order to end the recount. The Florida Supreme Court had instructed those making the recount to evaluate the voters' intent in cases where the ballot was not correctly punched in. The U.S. Supreme Court majority objected to this, saying there was no consistent standards for reviewing the ballots. Critics felt that the U.S. Supreme Court had voted along party lines. There were 5 conservative justices at the time and only 4 liberal ones. Some thought the court, with the majority of justices appointed by Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Bush, Republicans, was acting against the will of the people, as expressed in the popular vote, to put a minority candidate whom they favored into office. All right, a little bit about domestic policy. As President, George W. Bush pushed through a tax cut in an attempt to revitalize the economy. The Federal Reserve Board also dropped interest rates to their lowest levels in decades. The tax cuts revived the economy, but also brought a return to the high federal budget deficits. The cuts also mainly favored the wealthy. Bush claimed that the cuts were needed to get the economy growing and thriving again. As governor of Texas, Bush had been active in promoting educational reform. He continued that trend in the White House. As president, he introduced the No Child Left Behind Act, requiring states to test all students in English and math each year from 3rd grade to the 8th grade. So you can thank President Bush for some of your testing. September 11th, 2001. On September 11th, Islamic fundamentalist terrorists boarded 4 different U.S. airliners. Once those planes were airborne, they were hijacked. The hijackers threatened to kill the passengers and the crew in order to get access to the cockpit. Some of the terrorists were trained pilots. They then flew the planes into the World Trade Center in New York City, into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., and a 4th plane crashed in Pennsylvania when passengers resisted the terrorists and reclaimed the plane. 3,000 people were killed, making this the worst attack in U.S. history.
It's around 8:45 a.m., a chilled morning in New York City, partly cloudy. In Boston, American Airlines Flight 11, bound for Los Angeles, has been hijacked. Then a news bulletin. An airplane flying due south has crashed into the upper level of the North Tower of the World Trade Centers. 9:03 a.m. A surreal event unlike anything in the history of the broadcast media. Countless viewers are watching live when suddenly an airplane is seen flying in an easterly direction. The plane swings around the southern end of the Second World Trade Tower and explodes on impact. 9:30 a.m. President Bush at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, goes on television live to announce the disaster.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But even the president doesn't know just what is coming next. At 9:35 a.m., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon. There is no question now that the United States is under attack by terrorists. In Washington, the Pentagon, the Capitol, and the White House, as well as other government buildings, are evacuated. And Manhattan Island, incredibly, is sealed off. All bridges and tunnels are closed. And then, 9:59 a.m., a scene that will change New York for all time. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. And just a half hour later, at 10:28, the North Tower goes down as well. New York's Twin Towers have disappeared. It has been less than 2 hours since the first attack in New York City. An unimaginable number of people are dead and injured. The southern end of New York City's famous skyline has vanished. Nothing will ever be the same again. In a street-side news conference near the terrible devastation of the World Trade Centers, New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said, "I have a sense it's a horrendous number of lives lost. I don't know yet. Right now, we have to focus on saving as many lives as possible."
Osama bin Laden and his organization Al-Qaeda took credit for the terror attacks. Bin Laden came from a wealthy Saudi Arabian family. His father founded a construction company and became a billionaire. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 stirred bin Laden to recruit Islamic soldiers from around the world to resist the Soviet advances. This organization later became the basis of Al-Qaeda. After the attacks on the U.S., bin Laden was sheltered by the Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan. The Taliban is a terror group of Islamic fundamentalists, and they refused to surrender bin Laden to the United States. This refusal will lead to a global war on terror. President Bush voted to launch a global war on terror against those nations that harbored terrorists. In October of 2001, Bush ordered air and ground assaults, which toppled the Taliban and destroyed al-Qaeda's bases. Although many members of al-Qaeda were caught, Osama bin Laden managed to elude capture. President Bush also took steps to curb terrorism at home. A new federal agency, the Transportation Security Agency, TSA, the people you always see at the airport, took over security at U.S. airports, and all passengers and luggage were subjected to a thorough screening. In 2003, President Bush created a new cabinet post, the Department of Homeland Security. Its mission was to keep the U.S. secure from all threats, both foreign and domestic. Its activities range from nuclear detection and intelligence coordination to the protection of high-level government officials. The USA Patriot Act. Bush also sponsored the USA Patriot Act of 2001, which greatly expanded the government's law enforcement powers. The September 11th terrorists had been organized into 4 teams. Some had trained as pilots in America. They had cell phones and computers to communicate and bank accounts funded by international terrorist groups. This new act allowed law enforcement officials and intelligence agencies the power to conduct sweeping searches and surveillance. They could detain immigrants, monitor bank accounts. President Bush authorized the National Security Agency to wiretap suspected callers without first obtaining warrants. Critics felt that the U.S. Patriot Act gave the executive branch too much power and that it threatened individual liberties. Its warrantless wiretaps were later held to be unconstitutional. President Bush also imprisoned suspected terrorists captured in Afghanistan at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where the rights required by the U.S. Constitution did not have to be given to the accused. Prisoners who went on a hunger strike were force-fed. The Department of Justice believed that limited torture techniques, such as waterboarding, which is pouring water on somebody's face to create the sensation of drowning, were justified to obtain information from the suspects about future attacks, which could potentially save thousands of lives. Critics felt torture was rarely successful or necessary for obtaining accurate information. They claimed prisoners were treated inhumanely, even though some of them might have been innocent. Critics wanted to see Guantanamo Bay closed. All right. The War on Terror leads directly into the war in Iraq. President Bush turns his attention to Iraq. Bush and his top advisors fear that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein might provide biological, chemical, or even nuclear weapons to Islamic terrorists like Osama bin Laden. Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Kurds in the 80s, and although Hussein denied that he possessed weapons of mass destruction, he at first refused to allow UN inspectors to search in Iraq. Later, UN inspectors found no weapons of mass destruction, but some questioned whether their inspection was thorough enough. The U.S., Britain, and Spain warned Iraq to surrender its weapons of mass destruction or face invasion. France, Germany, and Russia favored a more cautious approach, calling for additional inspections. American leaders feared Hussein would use any delay to hide his weapons. In March of 2003, President Bush gave Hussein 48 hours to leave Iraq or face invasion. When Hussein rejected that ultimatum, coalition forces took military action. The United States began its campaign with a series of airstrikes. In early April, U.S. forces entered Baghdad. Hussein's dictatorship quickly collapsed. Later, Hussein himself is captured. He was tried for crimes against Iraqi citizens, and he was executed in 2006 by Iraqis. Meanwhile, coalition forces established a provisional government in Iraq. In early 2005, Iraqi voters elected representatives to draw up their own constitution. Soon afterwards, a newly elected Iraqi national government took power, and Iraq became the first Arab democracy in the Middle East. Although Hussein was defeated, the war was far from over. An insurgency consisting of former supporters of Hussein, Shiite radicals, and Iraqis angry at foreign intervention soon arose. Differences between the major ethnic groups of Iraq added greatly to the conflict and tension. American forces also committed some key missteps. For example, Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison were tortured and humiliated, adding to the unpopularity of foreign troops on Iraqi soil. By the end of 2006, as many as 1,000 people were still being killed in Iraq each month. President Bush announced a new surge strategy that sent more than 20,000 additional U.S. troops into Iraq. They helped secure local neighborhoods, protect the Iraqi population, guard the borders, and strike out at al-Qaeda forces. This new surge greatly reduced violence in Iraq. American withdrawal from Iraq then became the central issue in the 2008 presidential campaign. All right, a couple more things that happened at home. First, Hurricane Katrina. President Bush's second term witnessed the arrival of Hurricane Katrina. This hurricane led to the evacuation and flooding of almost 80% of New Orleans and other parts of the Gulf Coast. Excuse me. Katrina brought the highest storm surge and waves ever recorded to hit the North American continent, so not just the United States, but all of North America. Its surge and waves greatly exceeded the engineering design of the New Orleans levees. Hurricane Katrina was also the costliest hurricane on record. Much of the damage occurred when the levees in New Orleans failed to hold back the storm. More than 1,800 people lost their lives in the flooding, making Katrina one of the deadliest natural disasters as well. It caused devastation as far as 100 miles from the storm's center. Rescue efforts were so delayed that many citizens found themselves stranded for days on their rooftops and in their attics. Almost 20,000 people were trapped in New Orleans' Superdome, crammed together in sweltering heat and unsanitary conditions. The financial crisis of 2008-2009. The end of Bush's second term coincided with the worst financial crisis in U.S. Since the Great Depression in the 1930s. For decades, the federal government and Federal Reserve had followed policies to reduce swings in the economy. These efforts, combined with the growth of globalization, now contributed to an unexpected collapse. When the stock market dropped sharply in 2000, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to stimulate the economy. Many Americans took advantage of these lower interest rates and bought new homes. Some banks lent money to borrowers who could not really afford their homes. Increasing home ownership caused house prices to rise, leading to speculation in housing. Later, these mortgages were bundled with other investments and sold to other banks or investors. By 2007, overbuilding led to falling house prices, and some people with special mortgages that had adjustable interest rates. When these interest rates began to rise, some homeowners found that they could no longer afford their mortgages. This led to a rising number of home foreclosures, which is when a homeowner can't pay its mortgage and the bank reclaims the house and takes it back to sell it. Meanwhile, the federal government gave rebates to taxpayers and businesses in February of 2008 to try to re-stimulate the economy. In September 2008, the federal government took over the nation's largest mortgage lenders. Despite these actions, the financial crisis still spiraled out of control. Firms that held mortgage-backed securities started to fail. In the final months of the Bush presidency, several large investment firms showed signs of collapsing. The government allowed the investment firm of Lehman Brothers to fail. Others threatened to follow. Banks stopped lending and credit dried up for both individuals and businesses.